In this episode of Biblical Unlocks, we will go through a chapter of the Bible and make it make sense in your life today. Studies routinely show that reading your Bible regularly significantly lowers symptoms of depression, anxiety, and anger, whilst also increasing forgiveness, compassion, and a sense of purpose. So if you enjoy episodes like this, please consider following and rating the show. It's free, helps me out a lot, and you can always change your mind later. Enjoy the show. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Biblical Unlocks. Today we're going to be reading Genesis chapter 37, and we're going to see one of the most famous stories in the Bible, which is about Joseph. And it was his story, which is really important even in today's world, where we see the patriarchal narrative continuing. We had Abraham, then we had Isaac, then we had Jacob, and now we're going to see Joseph. And as I said before, I think it was in episode 50, about how favoritism in families can have dramatic consequences in our lives. We're going to see how favoritism, jealousy, and even betrayal is going to carry Jacob's family into Egypt, and it's going to set up the theological tension that is going to run throughout Joseph's life. Something I want to explain as well is that the message of Genesis is clear right from the get-go, that God's purpose advances through human sin, even through human sin. And that what you have intended for evil, God has intended for good. And we're going to read today. We're going to read verse by verse, and we're going to understand the deep biblical unlocks and cross-references that are present within. So, verses 1 to 4. Jacob settled in the land where his father had lived as an alien, the land of Canaan. This is the story of the family of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was a helper to the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his brothers, they hated him, and they could not speak peaceably to him. Okay, so verses 1 to 4. Joseph is introduced, 17 years old, loved by his fathers, but envied by his brothers. And we see this in Genesis chapter 37, verse 3, right? This is the verse. Now Israel, who was Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a long robe with sleeves. So the favoritism that we see here is what fuels the brother's resentment towards him, and is actually basically setting up the household for a complete rupture that we're going to see later on. But we've seen this idea, right? The idea of parental preference. We've seen this idea where there was favoritism in families. I said in episode 50, so about 10 episodes ago, we saw the same idea. In Genesis chapter 25, verse 28, it says, Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So that's what we saw way back when. So Jacob is actually continuing this parental preference. But remember, the preference that we see is actually going to cause significant damages later on. Okay, let's read verses 5 to 11. Once Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated it even more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright. Then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. His brothers said to him, Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us? So they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words. He had another dream and told it to his brothers, saying, Look, I have had another dream. The sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. But when he told it to his fathers and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, What kind of dream is this that you have had? Shall we indeed come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bowed to the ground before you?" So his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Okay, so he has two dreams. The first one is that his brothers are going to bow down towards him, and then another one is like the 11 stars and the sun and the moon are going to bow down towards him. This is going to be important later on, especially in Acts chapter 7 verse 9. So this is way back, way later in the New Testament, when Stephen is actually martyred. So Stephen was a saint, a follower of Jesus Christ, and he recalls this story. And you know what he says? He says, "But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him." So he said, and he remembers this speech that Stephen does in Acts, explicitly retells the patriarchal pattern and the brothers' hostile response to him. So this is going to be important later on. So it's important that we have this recognition in mind, that the dreams that he has, the animosity that his brothers have towards him is going to become a really important turning point in the story later on. Okay, let's read verses 12 to 24. "Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." He answered, "Here I am." So he said to him, Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring word back to me." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron. He came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields. The man asked him, "What are you seeking?" He replied, "I am seeking my brothers. Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." The man said, "They have gone away, for I have heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." Reuben said to him, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hands and restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore, and they took him and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. Okay, so the pit and the plot to kill Joseph, we're seeing that here. And we see, right, so Jacob was sent to check on his brothers, and then he arrives at Shechem, then he's sent to Dothan, and then his brothers conspire to kill him. They strip him of his robe, which represented the favoritism that his father had shown him, and then they throw him into the pit, right? And when Reuben was absent, they plot to kill him. But then Reuben steps in and says, "Let us not take his life, shed no blood, throw him into his pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father." So that's what we see. But what we're going to see later on in verses 25 onwards is something very interesting. But yeah, essentially Joseph is going to be sold to a caravan, and that's going to set the stage for the episode in Egypt. Anyway, we're going to read verses 25 onwards, 25 to 36. Let's read. "Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites." So Ishmael, remember, is the descendant of Abraham and Hagar. So the Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels carrying gum, balm, and resin, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him up out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. Then, When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where can I turn?" Then they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in its blood. They had the long robe with sleeves taken to their father, and they said, "This is what we have found. See now whether it is your son's robe or not." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph is without a doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloths on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol," which is hell, "to my son, mourning." Thus his father bewailed him. Meanwhile the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. So after selling Jacob, right, Jacob was sold. The brothers smear his robe with goat's blood and then tell Jacob, his name is Israel, right, that a wild beast devoured him, and grief immediately follows. Jacob mourns deeply, thinking that his son is dead. And it's crazy because this narrative is ironic in the nth most degree, and the reason why is because the brothers' sin, the brothers' betrayal of Joseph actually advances the providence, the divinely instituted providence that will save Israel. But the human cost that he experiences is real and agonizing. That is to say, despite the challenges and troubles we experience every single day, God's plan will continue to go forwards. Shall I read Romans chapter 8, verse 28 again? Of course. This is a really important verse in the Bible. "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." What you intended for evil, God intended for good. We read this in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, which is the last chapter of the Bible, so we'll see this later. "But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." So Joseph reflects on this later, and he realizes that all things work together for good, for God's purposes. I just wanted to say one more thing as well. There's another cross-reference to Psalm chapter 105, verse 17 to 19, right? "He sent a man before them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. His feet were hurt with fetters. His neck was put in a collar of iron, until what he said came to pass. The word of the Lord tested him." So that is to say that he was tested. He went through trials and tribulations. But that does not mean that the Lord was not with him. The Lord tested him. It was a part of God's sovereign plan, and it's going to set up the episode in Egypt. Okay, I just wanted to go through some important practical applications of what we're learning, right? First thing is, you have to be careful about favoritism. Favoritism has literally had a dramatic consequence in this story, right? Favoring favoritism actually can sow resentment between families, can sow resentment between friends, within communities, churches, family, work, any sort of relationship in which you show partiality can actually open the door to sin. And remember what we read in Genesis chapter 4, right? In Genesis chapter 4, we read about Cain and Abel. And with Cain and Abel, what happened with them? Cain wanted to kill his brother Abel because his sacrifice was acceptable to God, but his wasn't. And Cain was told by God himself, sin is lurking at the door, crouching, and you must master it. So, we need to master these things. We cannot just let favoritism run rampant. We need to be careful with the way we approach our relationships so as to not damage those whom we love. The next thing I wanted to say is that God works through, not despite sin. That is to say, sin will happen. We know this from Genesis chapter 3, literally the third page in the Bible. It depends how big your Bible is. But Right from the beginning, we have been born into original sin. Romans chapter 5 verse 12, for by one man sin entered into the world. So sin is always going to be there. But God works through sin. God has his sovereignty, his divine power, his divinely instituted plan, and he works through human wickedness. So despite what we saw, the evil that we've seen in Genesis, the absolutely disgraceful actions that have been present in this book, we read what Joseph says, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So when we come across these actions, these sadness, the wickedness of humans on this earth, we need to remember that God's providence will always be met. There is hope. That does not mean we excuse wrongdoing, but we know that there is a hope that Jesus Christ provides. There is a hope that God provides for us, because he works all things together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. We're not going to enable great sins. We're not going to do this. We're going to be careful, crouching at the door. And despite the sadness that we experience, the horrors of this world, the deaths and trials and tribulations that we experience on an everyday basis, we can rest assured that God has everything in control. I'll see you tomorrow. So that's it for this episode of Biblical Unlocks. This show is designed to help you keep up your habit of reading the Bible, understanding the Bible, and applying it in your daily life. I upload daily, so if you don't want to miss tomorrow's episode, feel free to rate the show and follow. Otherwise, just have a blessed day. And always remember, if you're not in your word, you're in your feelings. Godspeed.